Thank you, Alan. Good afternoon. Moving to Iceland, I expect you're rather pleased about that, having spent 2 days in the Faroes. And Iceland is typified by many things physically. Volcanoes is one of the first things that comes to mind, apart from ice itself. And of course this has been most topical recently with the Eyjafjallajökull eruption. And eruptions, of course, have typified much of the medieval period to our advantage, if not to that of the Icelanders themselves. But if you happen to be in an area where an ash cloud is descending and tephra is clogging up your lungs, it would not, of course, be very comfortable. And you can imagine what it was like here during that last eruption, and what it's like for the animals also, and this would have been no different in the past. Lava, and of course solidifies to these quite amazing moonscape-like landscapes. Generally covered in moss these days, and you can sometimes almost date, in a very relative sense, the different lava flows from the mosses that are covering the lavas. And not to mention floods. When these things are going off beneath glaciers, then we get the Jökullaups, these great floods of water that are coming down and washing away everything in their path. Let's go back, however, to Dequill and look at the beginnings of perhaps what is known about settlement in Iceland. And there's this rather famous statement which is generally accepted to apply to Iceland, to what was in the medieval text generally called Thule, though lots of other places have claimed that. And it talks about the fact that you could even pick the lice from your shirt, daylight or at midnight in this land. Of course, other places claim to be Thule, and this is Fula, so it says there's no alternative. We are there, but most people would accept Iceland. A recent statement by a historian, Jón Vidar Sigurðsson, said that little attention has been paid recently to the settlement of Iceland, but that archaeological excavation will throw a new light on this period. I suspect that this is someone who's not been reading what's been going on. This is not sustainable. One of the, well, in recent times, a statement on the settlement of Iceland and claims came from Margit Hemmans Aðaldóttir, who was working in the Westman Islands, the southern side of the island, and she has worked on, she has radiocarbon dates which persuaded her that this was a pre-conventional Norse settlement of the islands. And there were responses from many people, including our former president, Barbara Crawford, to her claims. And there are great difficulties over accepting many of the suggestions within her paper because of her use of radiocarbon dates. It's those dreaded dates again. And when you look at the dates from, and this was really the foundation of her beliefs, that if you look at her dates, they come out pre the 871 tephra, the Vedavotan tephra. There's her median date, which is, or rather her latest dates for her site, and there are the tephra dates based on the ice core evidence. What she's suggesting is that there was settlement going on up to a couple of centuries before the conventional land name date. Now, we've already addressed this in relation to the Faroes, where we have interesting evidence. The problem with using the radiocarbon dates in the way that she is that they're all on wood, and often old wood. And this, as we will see later, gives you dates which are really untrustworthy, and really her suggestions cannot be sustained today. But one of the places that has claimed to be the site of one of the initial settlement areas of Iceland is once again another Papa place, the island of Papey. And this interested greatly someone that we will meet several times here, Christian Eljan, the man who was not just an archaeologist but became the president of Iceland. And this is an island that's off the east coast of Iceland, and he looked at 3 places which he considered to be the oldest on the basis of their place names. And here are those settlements. We have Papateta, the Papa ruins, which certainly turns out to be medieval but not especially early. A place with a rather interesting name, Öskuhöla, Irish Knolls, which of course brings back ideas of the Papa in the Faroe Islands, but it turned out to be a relatively recent sheep hut. So this is a difficulty of tying in a place name, if you like, with visible remains. And then Gurðatetta, a byre beside a dwelling, 10th century, but not especially early. If we then go to the pollen evidence from that site and the related palynological charcoal proxy, then we see there's the land name, there's the settlement layer there, and the charcoal, which is that right-hand curve, appears just before it and after it, but certainly not a long way before. We are talking about round about 871 AD, that's the date of the land name Tefra. So there's nothing unusual there at all. And this was one of the main hopes, one of the great hopes of excavation in Iceland, to find something very early. Well, the sagas have their own, or I shouldn't just say the sagas, the related literature of Iceland, the Landnáma book, particularly the Book of Settlements, talks of people coming to Iceland and not necessarily settling there prior to this magic date of about 870, 871. And there are some of the expeditions that are mentioned. The one that's generally given preeminence is this one of Ingolfur Arnason, about 870, and that's also mentioned in the Íslendingabók, the book of the Icelanders. And this talks about settlement in terms of a permanent occupation by an individual. True or not, there's all kinds of political reasons why this person is being privileged in this suite of individuals. A 19th century painting of him arriving, and it tells us that in the time when Harold the Fairhaired was 16 years of age, and this is giving us a date for settlement. And it must be true because it says it on this. When people arrived, we are told by Ari the Wise that Iceland was covered with woods between the mountains and the seashore, and that's what we'll address in the next lecture. It's difficult to imagine that this would have been the case given the amount of erosion and openness that you see in the landscape at the present time. The volcanic activity has given rise to a lot of the soils that are going to produce friable, open, freely drained, but in many cases not very useful soils. And there's a great deal of devastation, as you can imagine. If you look at the 1362 eruption of Reykjavik, then that area there was completely obliterated. this area became deserted, and a region which was known as Literared, the small region, ever since has been known as Arafi, or wilderness. Strangely, if you look at the many family sagas within Iceland, there's not a single unequivocal reference to a volcanic eruption. It's not the case with all the literature, but with regards to the family sagas. And this is suggesting that people were either incredibly resilient, or were resilient in the face of something that was a commonplace. They didn't really worry about it too much. It was almost beyond comment. It's something that everyone was facing. But of course, what it's done is fossilized landscapes and via tephra, as we will see, become incredibly useful as a dating medium. And this was recognized at a very early stage. And in particular, the valley of Þjórsádalur. And there, a character who we will meet again tomorrow with regard to Greenland, Daniel Brun, he visited Þjórsádalur in the 1890s and foresaw that this would be a great place to carry out archaeological excavations, because he said that what we had here was Iceland's Pompeii. And he produced some very eloquent writings. I'm not going to read this to you, but it is a very nice piece of prose. And I'm going to look at a little bit about the excavation of this area, because it was one of the first attempts to look for the development of early society and settlements in Iceland. And I'm very grateful to Stefan Stuman Hansen for allowing me to question him over several days about the characters involved with the explorations of both Iceland and Greenland. He knows a great deal about them. He certainly knows the Scandinavian literature far better than I do, but he was willing to answer my questions and to go and look up things as I was asking them of him, and so he's aided me greatly in presenting some of the information to you. Well, this photo is a very important photo, I think, if you're looking at the individuals involved in the investigations of the North Atlantic. And this is a picture taken about 1929-1930. And Stefan found this in the National Museum, and I don't think it's been published before he brought it to people's attention in the aforementioned book. And I think it's important for lots of reasons. We've got a fellow here called Gustav Holm, who is very important from a Greenlandic point of view, an elderly gentleman at this stage, but we'll hear about him tomorrow. Goodman Hatt, a geographer who became an Iron Age archaeologist, particularly of the North Atlantic, and who really began made the suggestion, for example, that people should use wheelbarrows on archaeological sites, because this enabled you to actually excavate a much larger area than you otherwise would do. And he was really pushing, certainly for Denmark, where he worked, for extensive aerial excavations in order to reveal evidence of settlement patterns as opposed to just individual dwellings and so on. Unfortunately, he made lots of, you can't call them pro-Nazi comments during the war, but his writings were picking out those areas of German management and land use practices that would be beneficial to Denmark, and as a result of that he lost his professorship after the war, as indeed many people did in Denmark. But he was involved here in the investigations in Greenland. That's where this picture was taken, when people were beginning to think about taking up Brun's idea of looking at Iceland and how important that would be. Here we have Martin Steenberger, And he's professor of archaeology in Sweden, and also thought it would be very important if there could be a whole group of people working together on one archaeological endeavour. Paul Nordland, a Danish archaeologist, went on to become the director of the National Museum, who worked with Steenberger in trying to push this idea forward. Ole Roussel, who will be known to some of you because of his work on the houses of the Western Isles. We'll hear more about him in a moment. And, of course, very importantly, the pollen analyst, Johannes Iversen. Many people would regard, along with Knut Fagri, as being almost the father of pollen analysis, had he not been pipped to the post by several decades by a Swede, Lennart von Post. But Johannes Iversen, very important individual when it comes to the discovery that the pollen diagrams of Denmark had a record of Neolithic impact, of human impact, for the first time ever. And now I can't let this go without mentioning Niels Nordland, the son of Paul Nordland, who with his brother was imprisoned by the Germans for speaking out. He was a journalist like his brother, and they both ended up in concentration camps and luckily survived that. But Nordland suggested to Steenberger that what they should do is to take a farmstead, each of us in this group, and get a huge number of people involved from Iceland. And he then said that he thought that this was a really good idea. So they tried to mobilize people and to put together a pan-Scandinavian investigation of Iceland and Þjórsádalur. There's our Christian Eldjarn, who, as I said, went on to become the president, but here he is modelling for the museum for an exhibition, a medieval outfit. That's him later in life as president. And another very important person, Sigurdur Þórarinsson, who was the pioneer of tetrachronology. Ole Roussel and Steenberger were very worried, however, when things were getting underway. Now, Ole Roussel had had the baton passed on to him from Nordland, because Nordland was becoming very busy with work at the National Museum in Copenhagen. And he suggested that his amanuensis, Roussel, should perhaps take over the role that he should have been pursuing. And the two of them were getting very concerned as things were being planned, and we're now 1939, because the Germans were beginning to take a big interest in Iceland as well for their own ideological purposes. And they were getting very worried that the Germans were going to move in and get these excavations done before they'd even got underway themselves, managed to get them underway themselves. And this concerned Roussel especially. I mean, he was not just a great patriot, but someone who went on to be the first director of the Resistance Museum in Copenhagen in 1957. The problem was that one of the Icelanders, the director of the National Museum of Iceland, Matthias Thorason, he did not want to, it's not that he was pro-German at all, but he didn't want to upset the Germans or anyone else who wanted to work in Iceland. And he refused to keep them out, and indeed he probably would not have been allowed to keep them out, or not for diplomatic reasons, very easily. And Himmler took a great interest in this, having set up his think tank, the Ahnenerbe. They were very concerned about showing Viking connections with the Germans, with the Nazi machine and ideology. And so there had to be a bit of swift footwork here in order to not to be left behind. And this was done via, if you like, almost sarcastic pieces in the Danish newspaper. And here is one that appeared in 1939, where it said that Himmler was searching for ancestors in Iceland and talking about tracing this back to the Third Reich being traced back to the Vikings. You can read that yourself about people having to belong to the SS in order to work on the German excavations. And the Germans had to pull it because they felt they were being pilloried in the press. And Sievers, who was one of the Ahnenerbe members, took great exception to this and said how appalling this was that German science was being treated in this way. Sievers himself actually was hung after the war, after the Nuremberg trials. And you can see here one of the posters encouraging the Danes to fight with the Germans against the Bolshevism, and and linking it with the Nordic, or a common Nordic past. Let's look at the expedition itself. It did take place in 1939, in August. And here we are, these sites were looked at. People moved very fast in those days. Not a question of 3 years on an excavation or anything like that. Admittedly, there were a large group of people, but they were each taking their own settlement and then getting that out of the way after a week or two and then moving on to the next one. These are the ones in Þjórsádalur. They had enough time to even move over there and do another couple. But they were actually, for what, if you look at them, for what they were quite good excavations. There's Roussel. That's a honeymoon picture at Ballachulish. We'll come back to that. He was a great self-publicist. Here we are. It says he's found Viking traces in the North Atlantic. Roussel went there and was sending back messages all the time to Newland in Copenhagen, letting him know how things were going. And he said, I'll give you a small report. And he's not joking when he said, I went on ahead to get the most promising sites for myself. When everyone arrived there, he went off on horseback. Most people travelled on horseback. And he went into the valley in front of everyone before they could even get started to look for the most promising sites. And he did this all the time to stay ahead of what he would see. They were all Scandinavians together, but he thought he could get ahead of the competition here. So that's what he was involved in doing. And he had little reports on all the individuals, so that Stenberger's finds a horseshoe nail. Thordarson, without any interest at all in the excavations. He knows it all in advance as he can read it in the sagas. The Finn, Voyanana, without any knowledge of the archaeology of buildings, his planning is a nightmare. He's a Stone Age archaeologist. And his assistant, he had the future president of Iceland as his assistant. And I'm very happy with the small. Well, a volume did appear. And on the front of that volume, you'll find there's a drawing of Stun, one of the sites. There's a later reconstruction of the settlement of Stun in Þjórsádalur. And in fact, this is a volume which is signed by Stenberger, who edited the volume, sent to a journalist, an Icelandic journalist. And there we are. It's called, or translated as Ancient Houses in Sweden. The title there is actually in Swedish. He had a big problem here. He wanted the publication to be in English, but this was completely unacceptable to everyone else, which is slightly ironic because a number of the others afterwards always published in English, but they wanted this one to be totally in their own Scandinavian languages, apart from Finnish. And these were published in a mixture, obviously, of Icelandic and Danish and Swedish. Now, those of us who've edited anything will understand this one. He commented on the difficulties he had. And he didn't want it. He wanted it to be published on the anniversary of the German occupation, as to really rub it, salt in the wounds of the Germans. It didn't happen. It was a few weeks later, in 1943, but a great achievement to actually get it out in wartime. It was well received, apart from in Iceland, where they returned most of the books. And it's thought because, or one suggestion is, it's because Þjórsádalur was very unsympathetic about the results, because they didn't necessarily fit in with what the sagas would have told him. Eljar's view on the book, in the obituary for Roussel and for Steenberger, was that they're the biggest step ever taken in Icelandic archaeology, and that they remain a masterpiece, and they do actually. They are a masterpiece of their time. And Roussel, well, his view, he had a somewhat jaundiced view of lots of things, or an arrogant view of lots of things, and this is what he had to say. He was surprised that the Scandinavians managed to get their act together and actually to do this rather than talk, or having talks about talks and then dinners about the talks about talks. One of the findings there was that of the Þjórsádalur excavations was that the settlements had basically succumbed to the eruptions of Hekla in 1104. And this view persisted for a very long time, until people went back to look a bit more closely about this. Remember, they had a tephrochronologist with them, Þórsádalur, and this is some work that was done by Stefan Stuman Hansen and Ori Vestensen and others. They went to look at one of the sites, this one in here at Skálakot, and they were astounded to find that in fact the longhouses were built after 1104 there, and that the site continued to be used beyond this, and that this they suggested would possibly apply to many other sites there as well. It's not that Þórsádalur had got the tephrochronology wrong. It's a question of how many sites he was looking at, and whether he was looking beyond the immediate sites themselves to the terrain around those sites. More recently, the group, Andrew Dugmore, Mike Church, etc., went back there and looked at a wider area within the valley and areas nearby, and they were showing that we had certainly some abandonment by 1104 and so on, but that things were going on beyond that, and that we could use the tephra to look at soil accumulations and activities within the area. And the view was that there was no sudden collapse, and that the area was able to continue through particularly the conservation of land and woodland management, right up to and throughout the Little Ice Age. So in other words, it can be it's not that the excavations were bad, they were not bad, it's just that some of the environmental and dating findings were not as good as we would be able to do at the present day. Dating over this difficult time, and we've talked about this several times, the plateau effects and the period over which the Norse are working, are living, and if we compare it with the settlement layer, which you can see through there, or I say settlement layer, this is the land name tephra layer, dated through the ice core, you can see this problem, which I mentioned in the very first lecture, over the dates being either side of the true date as based on the tephra dated via the ice cores. And this has been shown, this is why I mentioned to you earlier that the work in the Westman Islands really cannot be sustained, and one can see an actual example of this from a site in Reykjavik. And these are paired wood and grain samples from a site, and here we can see that the wood dates are all significantly older than the dates on grain. and it's because a lot of the wood being used is driftwood and old wood. So the charcoal is not always that good. Obviously it can work, but you've got to ID that wood and be certain about its provenance, whereas with grain you're going to be reasonably certain. And yet at the same time you can see the problem with the radiocarbon error terms there. If we're looking for beginnings again, we can look at place names and supposed Gallic names in the Landnámabók. And what I've done is taken data here and mapped it. This is data published in Fredriksson and Sigurdsson, and actually looked at this on a spatial scale. And you can see here that these are the highest concentrations of names that one finds in Western Iceland. And if you look at the most densely populated ones here, as far as Gallic names are concerned, we're over there. And this becomes of interest if you look at some of the old place name work. Oftedal, writing in 1954, had produced a map which shows these dates on Lewis, and he says they have similarities to dates to place names on the west coast of Iceland in the Akranes area. And what I've done here is to actually link these names with a, well, I tried to animate it, I gave up. So you've got to forgive this spaghetti which you're about to see, and just to enable you to give yourself a landmark, there's Stornoway and there's Reykjavik, and now look at all the, and there's a Papa name that creeps in right there, but there's the spaghetti. That's linking all these names that are the same, or could be taken to be the same, in these two locations. So places like Landnámabók, which are talking about early people arriving here, and that there was a very large number of people from Scotland and Ireland, and it would seem that yes, there are these coincidences, and many of them are in the same order from north to south and so on, but not all of them. How realistic is that, or how true is that? How common are these names anyway? What I did was to look at the available names on the maps of Iceland, and this is simply one that I assume will be very common: laxa, salmon. And there's Ahnenerbe in the red square at the bottom. And some of these names you can dismiss straight away, because that is actually a power line which has the name Laxa Linja. But it surprised me that Laxa was not more common than that, but well, it's occurring in quite a few places in Iceland. If we take the name Cross, then once again it's in lots of places, but not everywhere. And I've not done this for every name, but then you look at other names within that group, Akranes and Leravoga, they don't appear anywhere else in Iceland at all. So I think there seems to me to be, on the face of it, something very that's quite credible here about the relationship between the Britain and Ireland and people moving with the Scandinavians, with the Norse, across to Iceland. And we can look at this further. A long time ago, there were notes about 2% of names being Gallic in Landnámabók. However, if you look at Stephenson, he says 31 to 41% of the first inhabitants were Gallic. And given the estimates of the number of Landnam settlers that were probably there in order to occupy the known Norse sites, you can't just look at Landnámabók and take that as being a true representation at all, because it's only mentioning about 1,000, not 20,000, if it was 20,000. And if there were a lot of slaves in those groups, then they were not exactly mentioned or going to be boasted about. And it's suggested by Ahnenerbe and Arneson that 30 to 40% of the population would have been slaves, especially during the initial settlement period. And if we look beyond that, these statements on skull shapes, blood groups showing the similarities that suggested greater between Britain and Ireland than they are to Norway, on the blood. And of course one can look at things like the Annals of Ulster, where it says that from Alba with 200 ships bringing away with them in captivity to Ireland a great prey of Angles and Britons and Picts. This was 871, the year that we have the roundabout that we have the occupation of Iceland. Is this where most of those slaves were then, or where many of them were being moved on to? And you've already seen that this morning with the shared ancestry, male, female, across the North Atlantic, or this part of the North Atlantic. These settlements have an attraction, especially in this area. And this is statements by Ori Vestensen and others. And the attraction of that area was because of hunting for walrus and the fish, the great auk. These are great lands to settle, especially when you haven't yet established yourself. There's plenty there in order to be up and firing and get your farms established without worrying too much about having to bring everything with you, because you cannot assume that all the necessary sheep and cattle and pigs would have been brought with the initial settlers. He suggests that many of the islands would have been used because you wouldn't then need any kind of earthworks or anything like that to keep animals in, and that there's also security, because he would also see these as times of insecurity. And he presents a model of settlement which can be looked at in great detail. We can't possibly do that here. But let's just look at a couple of examples of this. One is Eidolstræti in Reykjavik, modern day Reykjavik, and Húsholmi, a different kind of settlement altogether. If we look at Eidolstræti, here we have the longhouse, and here it is preserved underneath a building today, part of the 871 exhibition. And if you look at that site, there's tephra, the land name tephra, that can be found on it, but in fact the tephra is over some of the walls which are in the turf walls, which are in the area of that site, suggesting that settlement was before 871, but perhaps not very much before. And if you look at pollen from a site here, this is Chepstow-Lusty's pollen diagram. He's got charcoal here and early cereal type pollen, but not going back, but we don't have decent dating there other than the tephra horizon. And so it's very difficult to be sure what period is talked about. We also have Karen Milek's soil micromorphology work, which shows the difference between, able to detect the differences in the accumulated soils within and around that site. And of course this produces a wealth of detail about manuring and what kind of material is being placed within the soils to increase fertilization, and the presence of turf, the presence of burnt material, and so on. And her work on the contexts within that, looking at the chemistry, phosphorus for example, and many other chemicals which enable one to reconstruct what's going on within the houses in a lot more detail than would otherwise have been the case. But let's look at something rather different. We started off by talking about the problems of volcanic activity. And that's what we meet at Húsholmi, not a million miles from modern-day Reykjavik. And here you walk out over a lava field, and this was deposited in, or formed in 1151. Here is an aerial photograph. There's a settlement. There are surviving field walls. And let's go to the site itself. The site of two longhouses, a church, a post hole, 2 meters deep, partly preserved in the lava has stopped round about, it's inundated some of the settlement, and it's stopped at the walls of other parts of the settlement. Here is a field wall. It's pre-871 because there's the 871 ash on the top of it, but it's probably not very much pre-871. And there is the ash, there's the lava field, 1151. So we've got the landnam ash and then the lava. Look at the pollen diagram from nearby. Here's the tephra, barley type pollen, and there's barley coming in here, and you can see there that the pollen, the cereal type pollen, is appearing just immediately beneath the tephra. This would fit with Ori Vestenson's idea and the existence of places such as in Reykjavik, where you've got tephra immediately just above when settlement is beginning, that yes, the tephra is a very good indication of settlement wherever you are, but that settlement in certain of these areas almost certainly began just before the so-called landnam ash. And we have cereal type pollen now in these locations, predating landnam, just predating landnam, and at these sites here, which is contemporaneous with landnam. And there's one site, 3 sprue, and there's a tephra, there is the barley type pollen just coming in, and charcoal just before that, so fire, presumably domestic, or I'm suggesting domestic, woodland going down just before landnam, and there we are, dung spores. So we've got animals there that are clearly in evidence from other sources also. And the final weird type of site is up here. It's difficult to believe here, 70 odd kilometers inland, that you've got a site. There are in fact something like 500 lava caves in Iceland. 200 of them were occupied at some stage during their existence. Here is one. This is the longest of them all. Here we go. The whole system, 3.5 kilometers long. Part of the roof has collapsed here, but halfway along that, you had a defensive wall. There we are. And right in the middle, you've got a longhouse, or the foundations of a longhouse, which just seems incredible. A surviving fireplace, midden, 3.7 meters long, 100% domestic, bone in there. Most of it sheep, goat, but also substantial cattle, pig, even horse. This is known as an outlaw's cave. These were people, almost certainly, the sagas even talk about this particular cave as being occupied by outlaws, and much to the annoyance of the local farmers. I mean, they're not actually managing this stock themselves. They're pinching animals. They're going out and taking it. And we're told about some of these people, when they were caught by the local farmers, they were castrated and they were blinded, their pains. You can actually have cattle in a lava field. There's an example near the Mývatn area. And dating this, don't trust the charcoal, as I keep saying. Here is the settlement layer, tephra. Here is the date of the lava flow, round about AD 915. The lava would have been cooling then. You wouldn't need heating inside this cave, because the cooling lava would have given you your own central heating already. And this helps us to know that, given the problems with the radiocarbon dating curve, that our dates on the cattle must come within that region in there. But of course, those can't be seen as typical types of settlement areas. And here we are looking in the northeast of Iceland, up here, at what would be seen by Ori Vestensen and co-workers as a much more typical sort of location. Areas where you have lots of low-lying land, often flooded, and great for meadows and pastures, and that's the area in there. And initially with farms that in fact became permanent farms, very often close to pagan burials, which would suggest that these were early anyway, given that Christianity would have come along maybe up to 15 years, not 15 years later. They would have come along a century and a quarter later, but we have the survival of the pagan burials close to the permanent farms, and then churches and chapels for the most important farms, and they became associated with the areas of the grazing land, the outfield over there. But there was still time for other settlements to grow, so that we had these later permanent farms, such as here, which actually, as far as this region were concerned, eventually became the most important farms in the whole area. But because land had been taken up, their outfields were somewhat dislocated from the farm area itself. And then there were later possibly planned farms in the area. And also the relationship between various chieftains, and brought out here in a map based on work by Jesse Bayek, looking at the Thingmen in this area of northern Iceland, and where we can see once again these connections, and how people, in order to become more prosperous, would have links with people and try to get, would be involved in patronage with people in many different parts of the area, no matter where they were. And these were often changing relationships. One of the most incredible things in Iceland is the earthworks, which no one ever really talks about. There are, believe it or not, 150 kilometers of medieval earthworks here, and probably 100 kilometers lost to soil erosion, solifluction, and so on. And these are the most extensive archaeological features known in Iceland. And you can see them in covering this area, or they're known in those areas. This are simply those that are known about and have been looked for. They're almost certainly a lot more extensive than would be indicated there. And this gives you an idea of the density of these things. This is work from Arne Einarsson, who worked with us on the Mývatn area, who is actually a biologist, but he loves flying, and he's found a lot of these things as a result of aerial photography, and has also been involved with others in their excavation. And let's, to finish up this session, look at a series of aerial photographs that Arne Einarsson has taken, and he's given me permission to show to you. These are these massive earthworks that are going right across great swathes of this part of the area to the west of Mývatn. Here we go again. You can see them coming in here. A double one there, There's a longhouse. What are these like on the ground? Well, here's excavation underway just to see what's inside them and to see if they can be dated. You can see those lateral layers. We'll talk about this in the next lecture. These are subfossil turfs. These are turf layers from the peat. So these are peats that have been simply made into a wall, an embankment around a core of rock. And here is the core of stones, almost like a marker line across the landscape with the turfs over them. And of course, how does one interpret these things? Einarsson and Ori Vestensen see these as boundaries between adjacent farms and the fencing off of homelands from the commons. They were constructed, we know this from Tefra, between AD 900 and 1200. And this is one of the most phenomenal things, I think. In one of the law books, the Gregas, the Grey Goose books, which lay down just about everything, hundreds of pages of information about what you must do or what you're allowed to do and what you can't do. For 3 months a year, earthwork construction was to be given priority over most other work. And they were no longer used. After 1300, they became unimportant as one moved into a different land use system. Here we have another aerial photograph where we have a triple enclosure. What we don't know is this is reflecting perhaps an expanding, or is it a contracting home field around that cluster of medieval buildings. Here, that's modern, but this isn't. This is a chapel type site, of the type that perhaps the Bonhus type that we were talking about this morning in the Faroe Islands, with a church in the middle, a family chapel, and then a longhouse there. A longhouse, intriguing collection of buildings, or a complex. These are horse tracks that still survive. This has been abandoned since the medieval period. The horse tracks are still surviving in the landscape across to that settlement. An assembly site. So here we have a thing place, something like 26 booths related to this assembly site in the area. Thank you.